background?
So this profile that we're looking at and this report is what we call a personalised report. Me, as your Learning Power coach, I've looked at your profile, I've had a couple of conversations with you, and I've synthesised what I've learned from your profile and put it into this personalised report as a stimulus for our conversation. The other report that you got was automated, so it's slightly intelligent, but not as intelligent as me. In the previous report, you'll simply get different automated and bespoke feedback on each Learning Power profile about what it means and each Learning Power dimension individually. Whereas I've been looking at the whole profile, the pattern, and what I know about you in my coaching relationship with you, and hopefully it will frame our conversation positively. So you went online to understand your Learning Power profile and you want to understand yourself as a learner. You answered these 62 questions and you got this profile. So you'll notice, first of all, there are no numbers on it. So if you see numbers, you immediately think, oh, I'm good at that and bad at that. So this is not about labeling and grading. So these Learning Power dimensions are learning dispositions. They're how you tend to learn. In other words, how you tend to move into risk, uncertainty, and challenge. Because if you know everything, you can't learn. So therefore, learning has to be when you're moving into the unknown. Your Learning Power profile is your data. It belongs to you, and you get to say what it means. If you give me, 100,000 of these data points, and I can do the stats, I can make claims about that data set. But here, this is your data, and the meaning you make out of it is what's important. So we designed the tool in the first place to provide a stimulus for self-directed change.
And in terms of the data that you have on me, you also have similar data for everyone in the organization, right? So you could manage a team of 5 or 6 or larger as one coach.
Yes, absolutely. So you could look at the average score of a whole group and look at the learning quotient of a whole group or a whole organization. I would only have access to anonymized data, which is pretty important. Cool. Because the moment this changes into a performance management tool, it will kill it. Because the whole point is about learning how to learn, not developing a performance orientation mindset, which usually goes with numbers and labels and grades.
Great. Let's walk through it then. I've read of the different dimensions, but maybe it's fun if you just give me the high level overview again.
Okay. Mindful agency is the most significant of the Learning Power dimensions. We know that from hundreds of data points and analyses that we've done. So mindful agency is about self-leadership. It's about owning your own journey, being the pilot and not the passenger. It's about managing the feelings of learning, like confusion. Confusion is pretty important when you're learning. If you're not confused, then you're probably not learning. It's also about knowing how to go about achieving your goals. So mindful agency is pretty key. We could call it self-leadership. And sense making is about understanding patterns, making connections, and also learning that matters in your personal story. Basically, if it matters to you, you're going to learn about it. And that's one of the problems with schooling systems. Often what kids are required to learn doesn't really matter to them. Creativity here is explicitly about using your imagination and your intuition and risk-taking and playfulness. Curious people don't take things at face value, they dig deep, they ask questions. Belonging is a relationship dimension, and belonging in learning is a human need for being connected to people who understand you, where it's safe to be you, and where you can learn together without pretense with people that matter to you. Whereas collaboration, another Learning Power dimension related to relationships, is about learning with and from other people. Of course, that includes deep listening, because if most of us talk to be heard, we don't talk to listen. So deep listening is crucial to collaboration. Hope and optimism is very close to a growth mindset. If you have lots of hope and optimism, you believe you can engage with any challenge and succeed in the end. Your focus is on the process, not the performance. And then orientation to learning, you'll notice, is presented differently. It's the slider at the top of the spider diagram. And that's because orientation to learning is visceral, emotional readiness to be open to learning, rather than on the one hand just giving up and clocking out, being fragile and dependent, or at the other extreme, being rigidly persistent and doing the same thing over and over again and getting the same results. So being in the middle of that orientation to learning slider is quite important. That's the sort of learning zone. So those are the 8 dimensions of learning power, which have been thoroughly researched and validated over 20 years. And we know lots about them. For example, they all include thinking, feeling, and doing. So they're not just cognitive. You hear people talk about creative thinking, well, that's fine. But this is being creative, that's different. We know that there's a structure to these dimensions. So, like I mentioned, mindful agency or self-leadership predicts hope and optimism, sense making, creativity, and curiosity. We know a lot about patterns in the population. So we know what underachieving students look like. We actually know what corporate bullies look like as well, but we won't go there right now. Those are the dimensions, and the learning power profile is essentially meaningless statistically as we're looking at it, except it's a data point in a larger data set. But it's a stimulus for a conversation with you, which is about who you are as a learner, about your understanding of yourself as a learner. And that's the first part of the conversation, which we'll move into in a minute. And then the second part of the conversation is how can you use this new understanding to develop strategies for change that enable you to achieve your goal more effectively.
So what I'm hearing is there's all of this data on me. It's now a kind of meaningless report, but in our collaborative discussion with each other, we can arrive at some better strategies on how I improve my sense of myself as a learner and ways that I can go forward into my learning more effectively.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So shall we start with what you make of your profile then? What you make of it?
Sure. So from my understanding of the dimensions which you outlined earlier, it looks spot on. I think, as you mentioned, that there's these different interrelations between the parts that becomes super interesting to my mind. Definitely where we're both involved with some kind of like niche thinking, my sense of belonging is definitely dwindling. There's few people that I turn to, I can count them on one hand, who I'm really deeply engaged with. And this impacts things like my mindful agency, perhaps. I sometimes do also feel a little bit overwhelmed with just, oh, where do I go to find this information? Who do I reach out to? Can I do this? So seeing that on here is great. This really reflects the situation that I see myself in. Also, the rigid persistence, leaning more towards this side. Yeah, I think on this kind of like lone wolf journey, I've definitely started to lean more this way, but it's nice to see that it's somewhere in the middle. It's not just right there on the left. And yeah, the rest of it seems to reflect me super well. I'm also a hyper collaborative person, deeply curious about the questions that I explore. I feel very confident about the way that I approach my learning in general.
That's great. Did you notice, though, that one of the first things you talked about was a slight negative? Everybody tends to do that. We think we're taking a test and we're all enculturated into looking at the negatives. This is a hugely positive learning power profile. So you are clearly already a well-rounded and effective learner. It's just worth noting that because people like to describe this as a test. And it's not, it's a stimulus for self-directed change. So it's great that you recognize yourself in this profile. That's really important. And it concurs with actually what I've said in the profile from what I know about you. So that's a sort of a second take affirmation on your understanding of where you are in your learning. And let's just go back a minute to what you said about the purpose of your journey, because this assessment tool is just part of a learning journey. It's part of a process. It's not a silver bullet. It's just a way of having a conversation about what's happening inside of somebody and what they're doing out there in the world in terms of achieving a purpose of some sort. Your purpose was the journey that you were referring to when you did your profile was all about developing your understanding and exploring the skills, methodology, and theories of anthropology. And if you're successful in achieving that learning journey, i.e. exploring anthropology and anthropologists and the impact of anthropology in the world, then it'll help you clarify your own thinking, your own worldview, and that will then enable you to be a more effective communicator through art and writing. Does that summarize your journey?
100%. Yeah, this is a very new field that I'm approaching, and I probably won't go back to traditional academia to learn about it. So yeah, diving in to the field as fast as possible so I can learn some methods which can impact my writing.
And that's pretty important to remember the purpose of your journey, because firstly, the sense of belonging that you referred to earlier, where there's a bit of a dip, your journey is a lonely journey. There aren't all that many people in the world doing what you're doing, and inevitably that is reflected in your learning power profile. But let's just look at what I wrote on this page. I'll just scroll down so you can see it, about your profile. Yeah, clearly I'm basically saying it's a very positive, optimistic profile, and everything I know about you supports that. And very often we find people who working as executives in business or have lots of demands made on them that don't report lots of creativity, and you're significantly, you've got a high level of creativity in terms of intuition, imagination, and so on, and that's really great. It's highly likely that you are an intuitive and a disciplined systems thinker. In other words, I doubt with a profile like this that you will be willing to be trapped in a single discipline or an outdated worldview. You'll be wanting to constantly push the boundaries between disciplines, and also between what you experience and what you know and what you believe. In other words, you're a change agent. So being a systems thinker and being able to engage with complexity, this is the perfect profile for that. So that's great. So there are two things that, as your coach, I'd like to highlight. Is obviously about belonging. It's a pretty important area, and you've already highlighted that perhaps your belonging has an impact on your mindful agency, because you can be overwhelmed. And the second thing is, how can you stretch this? You're already an effective learner. If you want to get better at learning, how can we help you to stretch your learning power profile and become even more effective? Because actually, we know people's learning power profiles are impacted by the context in which they work. So if you're working in an organization and the dominant culture is fear-driven, through performance measures, there's not a level of trust in the organization, that will impact on people's learning power profile. In education, we know that the more highly controlling a tutor or teacher is, the more depressed their students' learning power profiles will be, because we're talking about complex learning systems, human systems. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's all about context. Does that sound like do those two areas sound like ones that you'd like to explore in relation?
Let's dive in. Yeah, the belonging piece feels super important. Yeah. And then also, it's something which I actively try to explore as ways to make myself feel uncomfortable. So yeah, we can explore them.
Okay. They might be related, of course.
Brilliant.
Why don't you tell me a little bit more about what you think the relationship is between belonging, in this case, and mindful agency?
The way I'm seeing it is the group could be this very empowering force, and it gives me more sense of agency over my learning, where I don't necessarily have networks or folk and friends who are associated with anthropology. This feels like a very sort of lonely journey in some sense, decreasing my agency or sense of it. That's how I see the immediate play out, but perhaps I also have a lack of agency through it just being a totally new field, and not quite sure how to navigate it.
Which could actually come down to your sense of purpose. So actually exploring anthropology is a very broad challenge, isn't it? So mindful agency is about a sense of purpose, a sense of, in other words, what matters to you, where you want to go, and you've got that in spades. A sense of agency, which is knowing how to go about pursuing that purpose. And then the third element is managing those feelings of learning. Being isolated in a big life challenge is difficult feelings which have to be managed. And I think you put it beautifully, actually, about belonging to a community and deriving an energy from that sense of belonging, where you're on the same page, on the same wavelength, and you're understood and you're received for who you are, what you are, warts and all, and your contribution is valued. And I think we don't understand that enough in general, about the sort of energy that can be created by this sense of belonging that's pretty hugely important. I think you're right about the relationship between self-leadership and belonging. So the big thing would be, what could you do to find more belonging specifically?
Very good question. Yeah, one that I rack my head with almost daily. I
Yeah.
guess Twitter is giving me a little bit of juice and excitement. But actually, knowing people on like a physical plane is very difficult now. It's just
Yeah.
COVID. But I also don't particularly know where to start with finding people in the field of anthropology, besides in the academic circles. I have friends of friends, but building these connections is kind of just more energy that I need to put into that.
Yes. And it also strikes me, observing your intellectual interests in anthropology, that you're situating yourself outside of the academic institutional world, which I think is very sensible, probably. But that also probably adds to the issue around belonging. And I get the sense that you're not just interested in words only or the ideas, but actually you're interested in the impact of ideas on practice.
This is definitely one space that I feel most of the academy is missing, or at
Yeah,
least I haven't observed in many
yeah,
other anthropologists, is the ones who really take it and put it into policy change. This
yeah,
is where I also like drop out of a sense of belonging, perhaps, where it's how maybe I could meet anthropologists, but
yeah,
who are the ones who maybe have a bit more of an entrepreneurial flair or are really like
yeah,
change makers in policy.
yeah.
This is even more of a rare breed.
So the question is, what can you do if we're taking this as a learning journey? Okay, so we might meet again depending on what we want to do, but we might say 3 months is quite a good period of time to say to get to grips with this issue and make some progress. So say we were to meet in 3 months' time from now, and notice that your self energy is required to figure out what to do about the belonging. So that's mindful agency working with belonging. So what could you do specifically? Can you think of anything?
Yeah, I guess I would have to find out where all the anthropologists are hanging out. This might be spending some time in academic circles, figuring out where the core forums, the groups, digital communities are. Also, just getting the lay of the land of the field, who the kind of big publishers and news sources are. Then, also in other ways, I can imagine asking around friend groups.
Mm-hmm.
As I mentioned, there are a couple in like friends of friends.
Yeah.
So following up with a couple more of these, and just saying this is who I'm up for meeting. Can anyone make the nice introductions?
Something that comes to my mind is the idea of coaching triads.
Mm-hmm.
And these seem to work very powerfully when you have three people with a shared purpose. Like they might be three people in an organization, they're in the same team and they're moving forward somewhere. Or it could be, as in your case, you find a couple of other people who share some aspects of your vision, if not all of it, and with whom you commit to connecting on a regular basis. So I actually belong to a coaching triad with a systems engineer from Atlanta and actually another engineer in Germany. We meet once a week for an hour, and we basically look at each other's learning path profiles and we coach each other in relation to our core purpose. And that's a really powerful way of getting beneath the surface of the normal transactional activities that you do with people. Because like we're talking now and it's actually going quite deep quite quickly because we know and trust each other and you're very open and you're willing to have it videoed and stuff. And I think that one of the purposes of the learning path profile as a tool, as a vehicle, is to connect the inside with the outside, to enable people to connect to their own internal self energy and purpose and strategies for change, but also to understand other people's self energy and strategies for change and to make those connections. So that might be a strategy that you might think is worth considering.
I love that I feel like we're focusing very much on this belonging piece, which is super important. And I wonder how to move it into another context just briefly while we're here is we've explored how it could work out in corporations. What kind of remedies, let's say I was in a secondary school.
Yeah.
What can you imagine being supportive there for someone who has a similar learning profile?
As you in a secondary school?
In a secondary school, yeah.
Again, the area for exploration would be, do you feel you belong in this place? Is it okay for you to be here? Who are the people with whom you feel it's okay for me to be me in this context? And if you can't answer that question, then there's a trailhead there, and it's pretty important However, if I was your teacher, I was once, and I was looking at your profile, I'd be thinking, yeah, how can I push this guy beyond his comfort zone? Is he really achieving? He's clearly a capable learner. I'd go and look at what you're actually doing. Was it stretching you? Is your learning experience appropriate for you? Very often it isn't, because so much of our neoliberal education systems are just about passing the test, and we know what that does to people's learning power. It basically negatively impacts on it. So I'd want to ask lots of questions about whether the diet you were getting in your school was really appropriate. And also, if there were lots of people like you, we could, which we are currently doing, for example, we can go and reflect back to the leaders of the school, how many people they've got with different types of profiles. Not that we would know who the individuals were, but you can identify underachieving students, at-risk students, as well as, in your case, probably effective learners, but that we would want to check out whether you were actually achieving your full potential.
Great. Yeah, this sounds like a brilliant thing to spot, not just the bad things, but also like the ways that everything could expand.
Yes, yeah.
So it's helping anyone who's designing learning journeys to make
Yeah.
informed decisions about the curriculum,
Yeah,
the ways that people are
absolutely.
connecting,
Yeah.
and like any kind of design shifts which need to happen. So
Yeah.
this is great. Should we dive into that second bit then? Like, how would I stretch myself?
Yeah, sure. This is where you need to tell me. What's the best way, of all the things we've talked about, what could you do that would really stretch yourself? Again, if we go back to you're in a school, what I would do would be to give you a big complex challenge that didn't have a single right answer, and say, here's a wicked problem. You can have all the support you like, and in 6 months' time, I want you to come back with a solution to this wicked problem, or a specific innovation or transformation. Oh, and by the way, I'd like you to show how your transformation would contribute to the sustainable development of the planet. So, in other words, I would push you beyond your comfort zone in terms of learning design into a wicked and complex problem solving process, which would require you to develop new skills, new ways of thinking. So, in terms of stretching yourself now in your context and the journey that you're on, which is wanting to explore anthropology, I'm wondering if there's a wicked complex challenge which actually is right at the core of your interest in anthropology, that you could take on as a personal project, a personalized learning project. That's what we're talking about. Extend your learning journey into something more rigorous that pushes you beyond your understanding, beyond where it is.
Yeah, I feel in the time of and the context that I filled out the report, it was really a sort of early day in me pushing into this space. What I'm pointed towards now is really making more concrete the realm of exploration that I'm going into and the outline of that project. Would you like me to expand on that?
Yes, I think so. What was coming to my mind, what you're clear about is your purpose and your passion. That's undoubted. We've got that. That's great. But the next step is actually collecting information, generating questions, and uncovering stories. So there's a process of, for want of a better word, data collection that you could go through. So you could actually just capture information that fascinates you and put it all together to make sense out of it. And that first stage. So I'd love to hear some of your questions and what your thinking is. And also, if you did that in a disciplined way, and we come back in 3 months and you tell me where you've got to, that would be even better.
Sure. Yeah, no, this would be really great to check in 3 months.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess the high level thing, the data collection has already started, or at least it's been happening in the background. And yeah, the 3 big buckets seem to be anthropological questions around learning organizations and configurations. What have we done in the past, all the way from kind of hunter-gatherers to Indian Vedanta universities, what's been working, what's not been working, mainly because the 2 longest standing organizations or types of organizations that we've had as a society have been religious or educational. So looking at what's working and what maintains these like long-lasting organizations. This is one bucket. Another bucket seems to be around economics and human development. So how economies are things which guide choice and enable or disempower people to develop. So there's this kind of anthropological question of how have people grown or evolved? How do they have a sense of this as they approach in markets
Yeah.
or in other kind of configurations and economies, and how
Yeah.
are these interplaying with learning? The final bucket of things, which seems to be a tools for thought thing, this is like around the premise of our tools shape how we think, and then our thinking shapes our tools. So this co-evolving nature of the tools that we have,
Yeah.
where language and numeracy and Cartesian grids have been previous tools for thought and enabled us to think differently or measure information differently and imagine new futures. There's some kind of interplay between economics, where we've come from and how we got to have really strong, lasting organizations, and also actually what technologies enable that thinking or that development.
Yeah, that's great. That's a massive set of related domains. Is that information just all in your head, or have you captured it anywhere?
I've started to weave together my notes.
Is it just material that you've read about in various channels, or is it also drawing on your experience? Have you, for example, been into an organization and noted your experience of that organization from an anthropological perspective?
Sure, yeah, both. A lot of it is collected from podcasts, a lot of it is foundational reading in books, some of it is research papers, some of it's more modern contemporary work, just like Twitter grabs and text.
Yeah.
And then also a lot of it is driven from more anthropological work, which is me spending a lot of time in Southeast Asia with religious bodies, India also in practice, China and religious bodies there. But yeah, months and sometimes even years of immersion in these different cultures. So
yeah.
So
you're actually already embarking on the project. So the stretch goal could be something we could agree that you come back to the next session with, which could be whatever works for you, but something that pulls together all of these different strands of inquiry into a map of some sort, like making sense of it. In other words, taking what you're doing already, but actually upping the ante by making it more visible to other people, and also being accountable for it in 3 months' time by coming back to me with a story and a knowledge cartography, knowledge visualization that actually makes sense, that you're excited about.
Yeah, this is like I'm going meta, but I see us now moving into like goal setting and like actual strategies for cool. I think this is a great next step, and one which I'll feel even more empowered to do if I could find the right collaborators and sense of belonging. But yes, I think in 3 months it would be really great to have like a kind of knowledge map notebook with a rough thesis or set of questions, which I was exploring here, and how all the different threads and trails are touching and intersecting.
Those, if you're willing to step up to the challenge, those could be your 2 strategies for change. One is to find a coaching triad using learning power as a stimulus for the conversation, because it's about sharing the journey together. And the second one, to up the ante on what you're currently doing so that your thinking is visible. The stories, the questions, the experiences, and all of the data is coherent, and you can actually present it to me as your learning coach in 3 months' time.
Sounds good. Yeah, I'm excited.
Seriously, I think it'd be great, and I'd be really interested. I think it would stretch you. The 2 things would stretch you. And going meta again, the accountability is pretty important here.
Sure.
You've got a purpose. We're giving a 3-month stage point really to this part of the journey, and we're going to hold you accountable for it.
Yeah, I'm really staying meta again, like if I was a student in a high school, this only initially in my body right now, if the coaching went well, it feels only empowering. It's not that I'm being made compared to anything or anyone. I haven't received any kind of downside or negative consequence because of my score.
Yeah.
And it just increases the sense of like exploration and going forwards into the world.
Yeah. And actually you've put your finger on the button there. It's pretty important. It could be used very badly in schools and in the workplace, high stakes and performative, then you've lost. So it's all formative. It's all about you. It's not comparing you to anybody else, but also it's empowering. And actually, just to say one more thing about schools, it's really challenging for teachers to let go of control, because ultimately you can only become a successful self-led learner if you are self-led,
Sure.
not just doing what the teacher tells you to do. So it's a big challenge for the system as we know it, which is pretty broken in my view, around high stakes testing and summative.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a whole set of things which really needs to be evolved around, almost like a mindset or a pedagogy or practice shift around how teachers engage with tools like this. I can imagine if they bring old style thinking into here, it could get a bit weird. So that's super important.
Yeah, you can't stress that too much. It's critical. If you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. And this is not a tool for the old paradigm. It's basically a tool for transitioning into a new paradigm where learning is truly personalized and people are empowered to develop self-directed lives effectively.
And from the perspective of, let's say, a headmaster or an HR team manager or something, it's not heavily performance based and we're not marking on scoring. How can this contribute to proving return on investment on programs and stuff? Is this, if I have the learning journey profiles of 20 people in an organization, how might that kind of impact key stakeholders in the organization, funders, investors?
So if we're talking about corporate organizations for a start, people who are empowered to develop their own learning power and become self-led professionals in the workplace are going to perform differently and better. And most organizations are actually having to change radically to pandemic, net zero, and all the rest of it. And so most organizations are dealing with radical change. So empowering everybody at every level within the organization to contribute towards that radical change through learning and innovation has a dollar value to it. Very simple example that I worked with, a particular engineer, 30 years experience, quite skeptical to start with, but eventually really got it because it was about him and decided to develop his own creativity and give his team permission to be creative and innovative against the new board's strategic direction of net zero. And as a result, his team came up with new ways of doing things that saved a lot of money because they weren't doing what they'd always done, but they were given permission and then they felt good because they'd come up with a new idea. And this is just like ordinary work teams in an engineering context.
Right. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is something like, by having these kind of learning power profiles with each person and helping them to become more self-directed and increase their kind of agency towards what they do, each person at every level can become a micro change agent in the organization and actually contribute to bottom line. And
exactly. And there is a dollar value to that. Proving it at scale is a big challenge, but we have proven it at small scales. But yes, absolutely, because behavior change requires people to make the behavior change. If an organization is going to change, it's going to be the quality of the people in the organization that enable that change to happen. If they're not empowered themselves as professionals at whatever level, they're not going to do anything differently. They're going to wait to be told what to do. They're going to be afraid of making mistakes, etc.
Are you familiar with the Kirkpatrick model of learning assessment? It's basically got 4 levels, and there's this gap in one of these levels where it's basically turning learning into behavior change. And this is notoriously very difficult to get a pulse on why the program didn't work, why you can ask people questions. Did you feel like it was contributing to you? Do you feel like it was valuable information? Was it relevant? And you can also measure performance and say, did you do 5 out of 10 consistently? I feel like this adds it helps to bridge that gap basically between learning and performance.
And I think Viktor Frankl got it right, that people don't change their behavior unless they have a reason to, like purpose. Optimism is everything. So if we can tap into someone's purpose as an engineer or a nurse or whatever, everybody wants to do a good job. If you tap into that personal sense of purpose and self-leadership, then that's what actually leads to behavior change in the right context. So just telling people what to do, changing the regulatory framework doesn't cut it for behavior change. People change their behavior when they have a reason to.
Yeah, massively overlooked in the current assessment and performance practice. We've wrapped up the conversation, the coaching conversation, and you suggest that the next thing that somebody should do after the discussion would be to
go back into your profile, and here's your learning journey. So you've chosen your purpose, which we've talked about. The diagnose and plan is the first point of the journey, and we've been talking about that just now. So go back into that part of the journey. Now, here's your profile, okay? And I think what you said you wanted to change was your mindful agency and your belonging. So why don't you talk us through it as you do it?
Yeah, sure. So we were talking about strategies to increase my sense of belonging.
Yeah.
Do I want to just put this right at the edge, or what feels more appropriate? I would love to feel a great sense of belonging in my practice.
Go for it then.
Okay, cool. And I'm hoping that this also boosts my agency because I suddenly feel more resourced to have great conversations with peers. So let's just put that up a bit.
And that's probably around the feelings of learning, isn't it? That part of self-leadership, mindful agency.
So I've set these sliders.
So scroll down, save profile settings.
Great.
And I think you'll be asked to, now you've got to commit.
So what did we discuss as strategies to improve these things? It was for belonging, I was going to create a coaching triad.
When are you going to do that by? How many times are you going to meet? Let's be specific.
Meeting weekly. You
could even put when you're going to start, or at least, and then revert back to me in 3 months.
Starting in let's say in 2 weeks.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that you can get them their learning power profiles.
What else? It was to also get the lay of the land and find key players.
In the field, particularly in the funny field you're in, which is in between academia and practice. So then mindful agency, this was where we were going to stretch you, wasn't it? In terms of planning your project.
I think there were 2 stretch goals.
It's some form of knowledge cartography.
So collecting all the data, observations and experiences and centralizing them in 3 months. Having a high level thesis.
So this is your report. So you can print this off when you scroll to the bottom, but those are the targets that you've set.
Great.
And if you scroll down a bit more, it's telling you what your targets are. There we are. So you can see what you've done. And then the rest is stuff you've seen, which is your detailed results. And you can export that as a PDF and send it to your teacher if you're in school or whatever.
Great. Is there anything else then, Ruth? I've set my goals. We've had a great discussion about my initial learning power profile. I've stretched it and set my new goals for my learning power. And we've figured out some strategies on how I could go about achieving that. Is there anything else I should know before we wrap up?
No, just do it and check in. Finding your sense of belonging is pretty key. And that's partly knowing that you will be accountable to present something.
Awesome. This has been really fun, Ruth. Thank you so much for walking me through it. And if people want to find out more about Jearni, where can they look right now?
info@jearni.co is an email, and our sort of Twitter handle is jearni.co, and then we have a website, jearni.co. I'm happy to hear from anyone and take it from there.